Welcome to Just Stories. We hope you enjoy the story. The Sino-French War, Clash of Empires, by Just Stories. Chapter 1, The Roots of Conflict. In the late 19th century, the world was undergoing a period of rapid change and expansion. Empires were on the rise, and nations across the globe were jostling for power and territory. Among these were France and China, two great powers whose imperial ambitions would ultimately come into conflict in the Sino-French War of 1883–85. At its core, the Sino-French War was a clash of empires. France, under the leadership of Napoleon III, was eager to expand its influence in Asia and establish a foothold in the lucrative markets of China and Indochina. China, meanwhile, was struggling to maintain its position as a major world power and was faced with mounting economic, social, and political challenges. The roots of the conflict can be traced back to the mid-19th century, when France began to take an interest in Southeast Asia. In 1858, French forces invaded Vietnam, seizing control of the port city of Da Nang and establishing a protectorate over the region. Over the next few years, France continued to expand its presence in Vietnam, as well as in neighboring Cambodia and Laos. At the same time, China was undergoing a period of turmoil and upheaval. The country was struggling to modernize and adapt to the changing world, and was facing mounting pressure from foreign powers eager to carve out their own spheres of influence. Britain, France, Russia, and Japan were among the nations vying for control of China's markets and resources, and tensions were high. One of the key sources of conflict between France and China was the issue of trade. France was eager to gain access to China's markets and resources, but faced stiff competition from other nations, including Britain and Russia. Meanwhile, China was struggling to modernize its economy and adapt to the demands of the global market. The result was a series of trade disputes and negotiations that often ended in frustration and disappointment for both sides. Another major source of tension was the issue of territory. France was eager to expand its colonial empire in Southeast Asia and saw Vietnam as a key strategic prize. China, however, viewed Vietnam as part of its own sphere of influence and was reluctant to cede control to a foreign power. This disagreement would ultimately lead to the outbreak of hostilities between the two nations. Diplomacy was also a key factor in the conflict. France was eager to establish formal diplomatic relations with China and to negotiate a treaty that would allow French merchants to operate more freely in Chinese markets. China, however, was wary of France's imperial ambitions and was hesitant to grant concessions that might threaten its own sovereignty. As a result, negotiations often broke down, and both sides were left feeling frustrated and resentful. Ultimately, the roots of the Sino-French War were complex and multifaceted. They were driven by a combination of economic, territorial, and diplomatic factors, as well as by the larger geopolitical trends of the time. Despite these challenges, however, France and China continued to interact and engage with each other throughout the 19th century, setting the stage for the dramatic conflict that would unfold in the years to come. Chapter 2, The Battles of Formosa. After years of tensions and failed negotiations, the Sino-French War finally broke out in August 1884, when French forces launched a surprise attack on the Chinese-held island of Taiwan, then known as Formosa. The ensuing battles would prove to be some of the most intense and significant of the entire conflict. The French invasion of Formosa was a bold move, designed to demonstrate France's military strength and gain a foothold in the region. The island was strategically located at the entrance to the East China Sea, and was seen as a key stepping stone to further French expansion in Asia. However, the Chinese were not about to give up the island without a fight. The initial French attack was launched on August 23, 1884, when a fleet of French warships arrived off the coast of Keelung, a major port city in northern Formosa. The French quickly landed a force of around 2,000 troops, who marched inland to capture the nearby town of Tamsui. However, the Chinese were prepared for the attack and put up fierce resistance. Over the next several months, the French and Chinese engaged in a series of battles and skirmishes across the island. The French, despite their initial success, found themselves facing a formidable enemy. The Chinese forces were well trained and disciplined, and were able to use the island's rugged terrain to their advantage. They also had the support of local militia groups, who fought alongside the regular army. The most significant of these battles took place in October 1884, when a large Chinese force attacked the French garrison at Tamsui. The battle was intense and bloody, with both sides suffering heavy casualties. In the end, however, the French were able to hold their ground, thanks in part to their superior firepower and discipline. Despite this victory, the French found themselves facing significant challenges on Formosa. The island's rugged terrain made it difficult to move troops and supplies, and the Chinese forces were proving to be tenacious opponents. In addition, the French were facing mounting pressure from other nations, including the British and Japanese, who were wary of French expansion in the region. By early 1885, the French had decided to withdraw from Formosa, recognizing that the costs of the conflict were outweighing the potential benefits. However, the battles on the island had demonstrated the strength and determination of both the French and Chinese forces, and had set the stage for further conflict in the years to come. In the end, the battles of Formosa were a critical turning point in the Sino-French War. They demonstrated the challenges and complexities of imperial expansion in Asia, and the difficulties of waging war in a rugged and hostile terrain. They also highlighted the resilience and determination of the Chinese forces, who were fighting to protect their homeland and their sovereignty. Chapter 3: The Siege of Tourane. As the Sino-French War continued, both France and China were determined to gain the upper hand. One of the most significant battles of the conflict took place in the remote town of Tourane, in northern Vietnam. The siege of Tourane was a critical turning point in the war, and would have a lasting impact on the conflict as a whole. The town of Tourane was a strategically important location, located on the Red River and serving as a key trade and transportation hub in the region. In November 1884, a French garrison of around 400 troops was stationed in the town, along with a small number of Vietnamese soldiers. The Chinese, eager to gain control of the area, launched a series of attacks on the garrison, beginning a months-long siege. The French forces in Tourane were led by Colonel Paul Gustave Herbinger, a seasoned veteran of colonial conflicts. The garrison was well-equipped and well-trained, but was severely outnumbered by the Chinese forces. The Chinese had a force of around 6,000 soldiers, and were able to surround the town and cut off its supply lines. Despite these challenges, the French were determined to hold their ground. The garrison was able to repel a series of Chinese attacks in the early weeks of the siege, using their superior firepower and discipline to hold off the enemy. However, the situation soon became more desperate as the French began to run low on food, ammunition, and medical supplies. Over the course of the siege, the French forces in Tourane faced a number of challenges. They were constantly under fire from Chinese artillery, and were forced to contend with outbreaks of disease and illness among the garrison. However, they continued to fight on, determined to protect their position and maintain their honor. The turning point in the siege came in March 1885, when a relief force of around 2,000 French troops arrived in the area, led by General Louis Brière de L'Isle. The relief force was able to break through the Chinese lines and link up with the garrison in Tourane, providing much-needed reinforcements and supplies. With the arrival of the relief force, the siege of Tourane was effectively over. The Chinese forces were forced to withdraw, and the French were able to maintain their position in the town. The siege had been a grueling and difficult battle, but it had demonstrated the strength and resilience of the French forces and their determination to protect their interests in the region. The siege of Tourane would have a lasting impact on the course of the Sino-French War. It had shown that the French were willing and able to defend their colonial interests in Asia, and had established them as a formidable force in the region. However, it had also highlighted the difficulties of waging war in a remote and hostile terrain, and had demonstrated the tenacity and determination of the Chinese forces. Chapter 4: International Intervention. As the Sino-French War dragged on, other nations began to take an interest in the conflict. Some countries, such as Britain and Japan, were concerned about the implications of French expansion in Asia, while others were eager to gain a foothold in the lucrative Chinese markets. The result was a complex web of international intervention that would have a significant impact on the course of the war. One of the most significant interventions came from Britain, which was eager to maintain its own economic interests in China. The British had long-standing commercial ties with China and were concerned about the impact of French expansion on their own trading routes. As a result, they took a relatively neutral stance in the conflict, seeking to maintain their economic interests while avoiding direct involvement. Japan, on the other hand, saw the Sino-French War as an opportunity to establish its own position in the region. The Japanese had recently undergone a period of rapid modernization and expansion, and were eager to assert themselves as a major world power. They provided support to the Chinese forces, including training and supplies, and played a significant role in the final stages of the conflict. The United States also became involved in the conflict, albeit in a more limited capacity. The U.S. had long-standing diplomatic ties with China and was concerned about the impact of French imperialism on Chinese sovereignty. However, the U.S. was also hesitant to get too involved in the conflict, fearing that it could damage its own economic interests in the region. Despite these interventions, the Sino-French War remained primarily a conflict between France and China. The French were determined to establish their position in Southeast Asia and were willing to use military force to achieve their goals. The Chinese, meanwhile, were fighting to protect their own sovereignty and maintain their position as a major world power. In the end, the intervention of other nations did have an impact on the outcome of the conflict. Japan's support for China played a significant role in the final battles of the war, while Britain's neutral stance helped to maintain stability in the region. However, it was ultimately the determination and resilience of the French and Chinese forces that determined the outcome of the conflict. The international intervention in the Sino-French War highlighted the complexities and challenges of imperial expansion in Asia. It demonstrated the ways in which competing economic interests could lead to conflict and the impact that external actors could have on regional conflicts. However, it also showed the importance of national sovereignty and self-determination, and the willingness of nations to fight to protect their own interests and way of life. Chapter 5: The Legacy and Aftermath. The Sino-French War of 1883–85 was a significant conflict that had far-reaching implications for both France and China, as well as for the wider world. The legacy of the war would be felt for decades to come, shaping the course of East Asian history and influencing the relationship between China and the West. For France, the Sino-French War was a mixed victory. While they were ultimately able to maintain their position in Southeast Asia, they were left with a bitter taste in their mouths. The war had been costly and difficult, and had strained France's resources and relationships with other nations. It had also highlighted the challenges of imperial expansion in Asia, and had demonstrated the resilience and determination of China's forces. For China, the Sino-French War was a significant setback. It had demonstrated the weakness of China's military and political systems, and had exposed the nation's vulnerability to foreign powers. The war would be a catalyst for further conflict and upheaval in China, as the nation struggled to modernize and adapt to the changing world. The legacy of the Sino-French War would also be felt in the wider world. The conflict had brought attention to the complexities and challenges of imperial expansion in Asia, and had demonstrated the impact of external actors on regional conflicts. It had also highlighted the importance of national sovereignty and self-determination, and had set the stage for further conflicts and negotiations in the years to come. One of the most significant legacies of the Sino-French War was its impact on the relationship between China and the West. The war had deepened the divide between China and the European powers, and had highlighted the tensions and misunderstandings that existed between them. It would take many years, and many more conflicts, for China and the West to find a way to coexist and cooperate. The aftermath of the Sino-French War was marked by continued conflict and upheaval. China would continue to undergo a period of rapid change and modernization, while France and other nations would continue to expand their colonial empires in Asia. However, the war had demonstrated the dangers and challenges of imperial expansion, and had highlighted the importance of diplomacy, negotiation, and mutual respect in international relations. In the end, the legacy of the Sino-French War would be felt for generations to come. It would serve as a reminder of the complexities and challenges of international conflict, and the impact that such conflicts can have on nations and peoples across the world. Thank you for watching our story. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, so you don't miss out on our next video.